Well, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this conference at the Lee Kuan Yew School. I serve as ambassador to the UN for over 10 years. And one thing I discovered that if you have a room in which a speech is being translated into 3 languages, it's important to make sure you count the number of points you're making. So I'm going to make 3 points to you, because 1, 2, 3 translates into every language equally effectively. So my first point will be about the school. My second point will be about Rising Asia. And my third point will be about ASEAN. And I will, of course, conclude by thanking the supporters of this conference. So let me make a point, one point to you about our school. I think when you go away, you'll probably be wondering, what should I remember about the Lee Kuan Yew School? So I want you to remember 3 points about the Lee Kuan Yew School. The first point, and in some ways is the most remarkable point about our school, is that we are less than 10 years old, but we are now the 3rd best endowed school of public policy in the entire world. Number 1 is Harvard Kennedy School, which has got $1 billion for 1,000 students and $1 billion endowment. Number 2 is Woodrow Wilson School. They have $600 million for 200 students per capita. They're the richest. And number 3 in the entire world is the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, with $300 million for 300 students. And per capita, we have the same endowment as a Harvard Kennedy School. And that's a remarkable achievement in less than 10 years. So the second point, which builds on the first point, is that the mission of our school is to improve governance in Asia. So only 20% of our students come from Singapore. 80% come from the rest of the world, and we try to get 20% from Singapore, 20% from ASEAN, 20% from China, 20% from India, and 20% from the rest of the world. So what you get at the Lee Kuan Yew School is truly a global classroom when you study there. But the third and probably the most important point I want to make, to especially to our visitors from the ASEAN countries and overseas, is that as a result of our relatively successful endowment campaign, in most schools you have students chasing scholarships. At the Lee Kuan Yew School, you have scholarships chasing students. So if you know of students, if you know of colleagues, especially young rising stars in the public sector in ASEAN, if you know of them, any of them who want to go and get a master's, either master's in public policy, a master's in public administration, a master's in public management, ask them to consider the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And if they are good and they are admitted on merit, I'm reasonably confident that we can provide them a scholarship too. So I hope that one way I hope you can help us at the Lee Kuan Yew School is to nominate more students to come to our school, and hopefully they'll go back and improve the governance of your various organizations too. So it's a win-win proposition for both of us in this regard. Now my second point is about Rising Asia. And some of you may know I've written a few books where I talk about the rise of Asia. And I always emphasize that the 21st century will be the Asian century. Now, I'm not going to give you a speech today about the rise of Asia, because that's a 1-hour speech. But I'm just going to make one point about the rise of Asia, which is relevant to your discussions today about emerging cities in ASEAN. And the point here is that, traditionally, and it has been the right thing to do, we have always gone to the developed countries to go and learn lessons about how to improve our cities, and I emphasize that we should continue doing so. We should continue going to London or Paris or New York or Zurich or Amsterdam. But the good news is that there are actually some cities in Asia which are also succeeding in providing lessons. And I can say with some confidence that some cities in Asia are doing well, because in one of the other hats I wear, I'm chairman of the nominating committee of the Lee Kuan Yew World City Prize. And just last week, a week ago, last Monday, we announced in Singapore that the winner of the Lee Kuan Yew World City Prize this year, and Mr. Khoo Chye was there, is Suzhou City in China. So this is quite remarkable. The first winner was Bilbao in Spain, second winner was New York City, and the third winner was Suzhou City. So it sends a very powerful message that we can learn from the developed countries, but we can also learn from the developing countries. And that, I hope, is a theme that will also be discussed here at your conference. And then my third and final point will be about ASEAN, because I often describe myself as the #1 fan of ASEAN in the world. Indeed, I hope that my next book will be on ASEAN. And I always say that in this world there are sunset organizations and sunrise organizations. ASEAN is a sunrise organization. And the future for ASEAN looks incredibly bright in the world of tomorrow. Because as we move from a mono-civilizational world of one successful civilization to a multi-civilizational world of many successful civilizations, the one fact about ASEAN that most people do not know is that ASEAN is the most multi-civilizational club in the entire world. Because out of 600 million people in ASEAN, you have over 250 million Muslims, 100 million Christians, I think 150 million Hinayana Buddhists, 80 million Mahayana Buddhists, and then you have Hindus and Christians and Taoists and Confucianists. So it's an incredibly diverse organization. So the diversity of this organization, the success of being able to cooperate against this diversity provides powerful lessons to the rest of the world. So as you discuss ASEAN today and building resilience, I'm confident that you will also carry lessons for the rest of the world. And this is one reason why the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy is very happy to support and sponsor this conference here. And so finally, talking of sponsorship, I'm delighted that we could do this in collaboration with Oxfam. So if you do not mind, a special round of applause for Oxfam for their support with the Lee Kuan Yew School. And of course, we could never succeed without our supporters, and I especially mention the Rockefeller Foundation and Microsoft for their support. So a round of applause for them too. And in case you're wondering why is Microsoft supporting Lee Kuan Yew School, I'm going to give away the secret. For a long time, we had a brilliant Vice Dean of Research. Her name was Miss Astrid Tumines. And after she stepped down as Vice Dean of Research, she joined Microsoft. And then, of course, when she went to Microsoft, she decided the best organization to support is the Lee Kuan Yew School. So a round of applause for Astrid. So with that, let me wish you a great and successful conference. I'm only sorry that I cannot be with you because after this, I'll be going to open another conference, which is opening in the Lee Kuan Yew School of a UN Leaders Conference, is also opening in the school today. So this gives you an example of how busy our school is today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dean, for that insightful opening remarks. Let's now proceed for the public panel discussion. And to give us and to facilitate or to moderate this public panel, may we call on the Assistant Professor of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and the project head for this conference, Professor Ora-Orn Poocharoen. Thank you.
Okay, a very good morning to all the mayors and the delegates from different countries, and ladies and gentlemen. So it's my pleasure to introduce the speakers for the first plenary that we have for today. Let me first start off by letting you know that this first plenary, we have designed it so that global talks to local and local talks to global. And that is why we have two keynote speakers, one representing the story of a more regional and global perspective of urban management, and the other representing Singapore, which is considered local, yes, but we are a global city here. So we hope the two conversations will provide synergies for our listeners. So to set the scene of the rise of secondary cities, first we have Mr. Donovan Storey, who is currently the Chief of Sustainable Urban Development Section, Environment and Development Division of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific, or UNESCAP. Mr. Storey has held other positions, such as the Chief of Social Policy and Population in the Social Development Division, also at UNESCAP. Prior to joining United Nations, he was an academic in several universities, specializing in social development and urban planning and governance. Over his career, he has coordinated numerous projects, including social inclusion and sustainable development in urban settings. He's currently co-authoring several books and publications that includes the State of Asia-Pacific Cities Report in partnership with UN Habitat, and he's also working on another publication called Quick Guide on Pro-Poor Urban Climate Resilience in Asia and the Pacific in partnership with Rockefeller. So please join me to welcome Mr. Storey to the stage. And then second speaker we have for today, Mr. Khoo Chye, who is a well-known urban specialist here in Singapore. He's currently the Executive Director for the Center for Livable Cities under the Ministry of National Development of Singapore. He has previously been the Chief Executive of PUB, which is Singapore's water agency, and had been instrumental in implementing what's called the Active, Beautiful, Clean Water Initiative, ABC. He has also been the CEO and Chief Planner at the Urban Redevelopment Authority, and also has held several top leadership positions in PSA Corporation, in Maple Tree Investments, and Temasek Holdings. He also has an adjunct position here at the Lee Kuan Yew School, and also at Nanyang Technological University. So please join me to welcome Professor Khoo Chye on the stage. So may I first invite Mr. Storey for his first talk.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm just recovering from a slight flu that's going around Bangkok at the moment, but so hopefully I won't be too croaky. I'll also take the good advice of our previous speaker who welcomed us to Lee Kuan Yew, and just really highlight some key points from my presentation. Obviously the presentation will be available, so I just want to highlight 2 or 3 key points on each slide, because I also want to leave plenty of time for my colleague to talk about the Singapore experience. And I also don't want to overwhelm you with too much information, because my role really is to set the scene for this morning and also the 2 days of the workshop. Okay, so my job is to primarily set the scene, which is not particularly easy, not even from a United Nations ESCAP perspective, because we have some 62 member and associate member countries to summarise, right from Turkey in the one corner of our region, across to Tonga in the other corner of the region. So breaking that down to the urban experiences is also very complex. But if I can raise sort of 3 or 4 overall points and then some relating to secondary cities. One of the most, if not the most important demographic trend this century will be urbanisation in the region. And in fact, Africa and Asia will really dominate the urban landscape through this century. the Asia-Pacific region is actually comparatively under-urbanised globally. And so the transition for this region will be very pronounced over the next 3 decades in particular, in which we'll move to roughly just over 40% living in urban areas to almost 2/3 of the region living in urban areas in a period of little more than 40 odd years. It's quite a significant percentage shift. It's even more significant because of the numbers involved. We're looking at around 1.3 to 1.5 billion people moving into cities in the next 3 decades. So it's the numbers as well as the proportions. What is interesting is that this region is, if you like, famous for its mega cities and for its mega urban regions, but it is actually a city of small and medium. It's actually a region of small and medium-sized cities. And in fact, the vast majority of urban, or the majority of urban people in the region still live in cities of less than 1 million. And in the next phase of development over the next 3 or 4 decades, the vast majority will live in cities of 1 to 5 million people. Only around about 11% of the region's population live in megacities, and that will likely peak at around 15 to 16% in around 30 or 40 years' time. Of course, I give you these statistics with a big pinch of salt, because understanding city boundaries and understanding urban areas is becoming much more complex in this region. Cities in the Asia-Pacific region are increasingly radiating out into urban regions. So to get up here and not be a little bit cynical when I say this and this percentage is quite difficult, because these percentages are good guides, but they don't really capture the changing urban experience. However, what is very important to note is the importance of medium-sized and secondary cities. If we visualize it, the top blue line is the cities, the megacities of 10 million or more, and you can see those starting to plateau out in 2025. Still very large numbers, but not growing at the rate that they once were. But the real action is taking place with the green line, cities of 1 to 5 million, and still the blue line blue-purple line of 500,000 to 1 million. So you can see that these proportions are very important in terms of cities, particularly of 5 million and under, where rates are still very high. At the national level, the importance of these cities is growing economically, socially, and soon we'll talk about in terms of environmental sustainability and moving towards greener cities and particularly low carbon cities as well. China, for example, has roughly 130 odd second tier cities of 1 to 10 million. India, some 40 cities of under 5 million. But even in other countries in the region, we increasingly see the names of cities we recognise as being very significant in terms of regional and national economies. And we also see a second issue, which I'll raise in a minute, is the clustering of cities. And in fact, many of the faster growing secondary cities are on the outskirts of megacities, or certainly what we refer to as mega urban regions or urban corridors. But it's very difficult to define clearly what we mean by secondary cities. And I think this is more than an academic exercise. Mostly we use numbers. And that depends again on the definition, national definitions rather than globally agreed definitions. There are a range of definitions of what a secondary city is, and it's a little bit like defining a non-government organisation. We define a non-government organisation by the fact of what it is not rather than what it is. It is a non-government organisation. And with secondary cities, we tend to define these cities by what they are not, the primary cities or the capital cities. But that doesn't really tell us much about what they are. And so we need to be very cautious in creating this envelope in which we put secondary cities in and say this is a secondary city. Secondary cities have a huge range of different pasts, of different presents, and if you like, different futures. They have different relationships to other cities. They have different relationships to their regions and hinterlands. They have different relationships to capital cities. They have very different economic and social structures. So while we talk about secondary cities in a kind of an easy way in terms of even Rondinelli's very well-known definition of a secondary city, the reality is that there are many, many different past, present and futures of secondary cities, and those people in the room, particularly the mayors, will know that very well. That secondary cities will not and have not developed in the same way, and there are many different strategies to success as a secondary city. And the term secondary city is quite problematic and really needs to be unpacked when we talk about the future in particular. And of course the final point there is that secondary cities are really governed by their broader frameworks. The space that's open to a secondary city, its relationship to other cities and to national development is defined by the level and nature of decentralisation, whether we're talking about a state or a federal structure, whether we're talking about a provincial structure, whether there is no decentralisation, and so on. So many things can shape a secondary city and the role of the secondary city in a national and also regional economy. And so we have many different experiences of secondary cities and therefore many different strategies to success. So in this image here, I've just shown you pictures of, in the top, your top left, of Daegu in Republic of Korea, which is moving from an industrial base to a sort of a conference centre, an international conference centre city, and also an expert city on water systems, in particular clean water systems. Below Daegu is Cebu City in the Visayas, which is playing a very strong regional role. In the middle here is Lanakul town, the second largest town in the island of Tanna in southern Vanuatu. Very small town of some 3,000 people with a cooperative, 4 or 5 shops, but which is very important in terms of being a secondary town of where it is in Vanuatu. And in the top right, Bukhara in Uzbekistan, a very historic, very important city on the Silk Route, which is reviving that role after a long period of decline from Soviet period. And on the bottom right, you can see this incredible juxtaposition of informal settlements and Laguna de Bay, Laguna Lake around metropolitan Manila. All secondary cities of one form or another, very different places, very different development dynamics, very different socio-economic and political systems and structures as well. I want to take a few slides then to look at some of the opportunities and challenges for secondary cities, taking into account those cautions about homogenising or treating secondary cities as the same. Over the literature, and many of the mayors will contribute and enrich this discussion in the next couple of days, but secondary cities, where they have succeeded well, they've tended to use certain attributes. Lower land costs and more flexible land systems, locational advantages, what I call intrinsic locational advantages, that is, they are on transportation routes or close to mega-urban regions, or what I've referred to as devised locational advantages, where local governments have been quite sophisticated in creating a local advantage for new economies and potentially new transportation and economic routes. There are also unique attributes which shape secondary cities. Some are very important historical and heritage locations, and they're seeking to maximise that. Chiang Mai is a good example of that in Thailand. But also we see secondary cities succeeding when they're able to diversify away from these single bases of success. And I'll get to this point again towards the end. But diversification is a challenge for many secondary cities. Many secondary cities have succeeded for short periods of time on the basis of creating a niche. But where we see long-term success, it's where secondary cities have managed to transform themselves with a much more diverse socio-economic base. But that is very difficult for secondary cities in many countries. And strategically, secondary cities are trying to position themselves as being lower cost centres, particularly for transportation and logistics costs for international companies. Cities have created, as I said, niches in very different nature of industries, whether that be IT, manufacturing, electronics and so on. They've also created themselves as regional centres, effectively where they have succeeded with regional economies and rural economies as well. And increasingly secondary cities are looking to play a more regional and global role, which I think of is of great interest. Here there are often tensions with national governments because there are a great many constraints placed upon cities and their international roles. But even through organisations such as ASEAN, UCLG and CityNet, we see secondary cities starting to want to play this broader horizontal role across the region and the globe rather than a vertical role with the primary or capital city. And this is, I think, of great interest as well. However, there are also growing pains of growth which are clear, and I just want to highlight a couple of key points here. One is the rapid change taking place in secondary cities, rapid population change. The second is, if you like, the regulatory and fiscal and legal framework, which tends to be weaker in secondary cities and placed under strain through their rapid development. Creating quality and decent work and decent paying jobs can be very difficult for many secondary cities as well. Socially, secondary cities tend to exhibit relatively higher levels of inequality than some of the region's larger cities. And there's also weaker social support and social protection systems that have been developed in secondary cities where they don't exist nationally. And there are great infrastructure deficits through growth. And there's a great challenge of how to pay for the infrastructure that's required. And here secondary cities are managing to keep up with infrastructure and transportation demands, but very rarely have they got the capacity, financial and resource-wise, to go beyond management and towards future growth planning. And finally, there's the challenge of more sophisticated governance systems. This meeting is a very good opportunity to learn more on those. But you know, there are limited financial and human resources, and in many secondary cities in the region, local government has enough to keep itself going, but doesn't often have the funding and the resources required to think strategically and to, if you like, go further out than basic administration. And this then reflects very much the nature of decentralisation and funding systems. Many secondary cities are really hemmed in by a drip feeding of funds from national sources rather than being able to create their own fiscal base to be able to develop. Just a couple of very short slides before we move into some of the conclusions. But there is another side to the story as well, and that is the decline of secondary cities. We talk about growth and the region of growth, but in fact there are many stories of decline and how decline has been managed and some of the difficulties of decline. Japan, for example, is facing decline of many secondary cities and provincial capitals over the last 20 to 30 years. The instruction here is this hollowing out of old industries, the moving out of industries. And I think this is a particular challenge for this, again, this monocentric economic base. That is, that we're doing really well in IT, really well in manufacturing, really well in tourism. And the danger is for many secondary cities is to build their development around these single approaches. And what we've learned from Japan and East and Central Asia in particular is when those industries and when those opportunities shift on, as they inevitably do, there's a hollowing out of urban development. There's a hollowing out of the economic base, and there's a great deal many difficulties from that. And the Japan experience has been one of pouring a lot of money into revitalisation of secondary cities, but it is a very difficult and very expensive exercise. And again, I think one of the key lessons from the Japanese experience, as well as even those in rapid growth areas, Yantian and the Pearl River Delta, Central Asia, the failed industrialisation of mono cities, and also failed master plan cities, the failures of placemaking. There's a lot of important lessons to be learned from failure rather than just success. And I think those important lessons need to be shared and discussed in terms of the secondary city challenge. A couple of slides on environmental challenges, though we'll get onto those more later in the next session, so I just want to touch upon that, and you can refer to these slides afterwards. But secondary cities are often seen as the most also vulnerable to climate and environmental changes as well. Not only coastal cities, but it has to do with this package of more limited resources, a smaller fiscal base, often being able to operate in systems which don't allow decentralisation and adaptive capacity at the local level. And I think one of the key challenges in terms of secondary cities is with regards to adaptation to climate change and environmental change. But I think here there is a great opportunity. And in fact, secondary cities really have this enormous opportunity of being at the forefront of urban adaptation and mitigation strategies. And here I think one of the dangers of secondary cities is their mimicry of larger cities. And one of the dangers is that secondary cities will be cities which are built for the 19th and 20th centuries, whereas I think there's a real opportunity for secondary cities to be built for the 21st and 22nd century. And this is a difficult thing to fund, of course, but I think that creativity around building cities for the future is critical. We're talking about cities of 1 to 5 million today, but they will be the cities of 5 to 15 million at the end of this century. And they really have to be built very differently from today's megacities if we are to avoid those problems of vulnerability and a lack of resilience. So I see great challenges in terms of adaptation and resilience for secondary cities, but I think really they herald the future opportunities for newer and more creative cities. I'm just going to leave this slide up there for referral later, but through ASEAN and the Rockefeller Foundation, there are many different programs which have been developed to create new forms of resilience, to lessen vulnerability of emerging cities, and to create the opportunities of building new and innovative urban structures and functions. And I think, refer you to this literature in terms of what has been done in some of the smaller and medium-sized cities in the region. Some of those cities are here and they can share their experiences. But again, to leave you with that point that we have a real opportunity with secondary cities to create very different cities for the future. Chiang Rai is one that's heralded through UN Habitat Awards and also through the ASEAN program of using its locational advantages with wetlands for wastewater systems, of creating an enabling environment for the different forms of transportation, of building in urban agriculture systems for the future, and so on. And these are the creative opportunities that many of the mayors will share over the next couple of days. And so the final slide is really to reinforce the opportunities that we have through this growth, but also the importance of a reorientation of not only academic but also policy attention to the creation of new kinds of cities for the future. Secondary cities, I think we'd all agree in this room, although we're preaching somewhat to the converted, remain largely an untapped resource for the future. But if you look at the data and if you look at the future urban prospects for this region, these are our future. This is the future of our urban region. It's in the secondary cities. It's in the small and medium-sized cities. The mega cities have their own challenges and their own issues, but these medium and secondary-sized cities are really where our urban future will be shaped to a great extent. But this development experience is not linear. We cannot homogenise secondary cities. They will be vulnerable to shifting regional, national and global economies and systems which we know over the last 20 years of economic shocks are in a constant state of flux. It's very important then that policy creates a diverse framework. It creates a diverse economic base, and it creates an enabling function for social inclusion, which I think is very important. State policy and the relationship to national governments is another very important factor which will be raised, I'm sure, through this meeting. And I think the most important thing too from a sustainability perspective, through the future global sustainability, is that the performance of this region's medium and secondary cities through this century will be critical, not only to national environmental strategies and sustainability strategies and resilience, not only to regional issues along those regards, but I would argue to global prospects in terms of mitigation and adaptation strategies. And here the region and its secondary cities has a very important role to play, and it has a very important leadership role to play. And so I'm glad to have, through this meeting, the mayors of many of these cities who I'm sure will rise to that challenge. Thank you.
Good morning, distinguished mayors and guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank the LKY School and Oxfam for inviting me to give this address, and I'm really very, very honored. Singapore, as you know, is an island, just barely 700 square kilometers or a little bit more, but it's very densely populated with 5.4 million people and no other natural resources like land, water, energy. And we are both a city and a state. So we have to fit in the needs of a nation within a city, such as airports. We actually have 5 airports, seaports, military training grounds, water catchments, and nature reserves. So we grapple with a unique challenge in pursuing growth while ensuring that our city is both livable and sustainable. And by various rankings and surveys, Singapore today is one of the more livable cities in the world. But the idea of Singapore being a global livable city 50 years ago would have seemed preposterous, as we were then an overcrowded city. Even though the population was only around 1.5 million people, with high unemployment, slums, horrid traffic congestion, polluted rivers, water shortages, crime, and disease. Far from being seen as an emerging city, or probably even a secondary city, we were probably seen as a city in decline. In those days, the most advanced cities in our part of the world were cities like Manila and Colombo. So we know that cities can emerge and they can fall very quickly. So while we have done well so far, the question we keep asking ourselves in Singapore is how do we sustain and keep building on what we have achieved so far to make the city livable, sustainable, and resilient. This is the question that the Center for Livable Cities is studying, and we are trying to distill the lessons and principles from Singapore, as they are important for us to make sure we learn from both our successes as well as our mistakes, and we hope that these lessons will also be of value to other cities. A little bit about the Centre. We were established in June 2008 by the government, the Ministry of National Development and the Ministry of Environment and Water Resources, as a knowledge centre for livable and sustainable cities. Our mission is to distill, to create and to share knowledge on livable and sustainable cities. The Centre actively engages and collaborates with a wide network of cities, international organizations, universities and companies to create platforms, to undertake collaborative research, to share knowledge and best practices. The CLC's knowledge base of our 22 comes from our 22 stakeholder agencies, which are public sector agencies in Singapore. And we undertake research primarily through case study documentation of Singapore's experience. We carry out capability development programs for both Singapore as well as international city officials. And we promote good planning and governance of livable and sustainable cities through our publications, through talks, and major conferences like the World Mayors Forum and the City Summit, and the establishment of the Lee Kuan Yew World City Prize, which Kishore talked about, and I'll mention a little bit more later on. Why do we think the Singapore model of urbanization offers lessons for other cities? This livability matrix plots population density versus livability and shows that Singapore is one of the few cities which are high density and highly livable. The emerging cities of tomorrow are likely to be resource scarce, densely populated, and largely located in regions, as the previous speaker has spoken, in regions like Asia, Latin America, and Africa. So a useful model of sustainable development may look less like the traditional low-density livable cities that we see, like Melbourne or Vancouver, and they are going to be more like Singapore, Hong Kong, or Seoul. At CLC, we believe that Singapore's experience in city development and governance is especially relevant to the many emerging high-density cities. Many cities send their officials to Singapore to study and learn from Singapore's experience by visiting our agencies and making site visits. They then try to copy what is more visible and easier to copy, usually by hiring some consultant, not academic, since I'm talking to LKY School. But then they don't quite achieve the desired outcomes. They focus on the what's, but not the how's of making a city livable and sustainable. At CLC, we have tried to distill the principles from Singapore's experience in livability in a livability framework. The framework is like a pyramidal iceberg with the livability outcomes of economic competitiveness, sustainable environment, and quality of life, the what's, which are usually visible and measurable above the waterline, if you like. But what sustain these outcomes are the less obvious hows. We think these are the two key urban systems of an integrated approach to planning and development and dynamic urban governance. Think of these as, firstly, integrated master and planning development is the technocratic system comprising the bureaucracy as well as the private sector and the community that delivers the plans and programs, which are inspired by two dynamic urban governance, i.e. the way the society is run and organized to decide what outcomes it wants to achieve and how to mobilize the resources to achieve them. So integrated master planning and development, drawing from our experience, is about thinking long-term, fighting productively, building in flexibility, executing effectively, and innovating systematically. And dynamic urban governance is about leading with vision and pragmatism, building a culture of integrity, especially in the public sector, cultivating sound institutions, involving the community as stakeholders, and working with markets. We need these systems to achieve sustainable outcomes because in any city, trying to achieve a good balance between the quality of life for the people with a sustainable environment and a competitive economy is an immensely complex task, as many of you here as mayors will know. There will be costs and trade-offs and political challenges, especially in high-density, rapidly growing cities. Dynamic urban governance supported by an integrated approach to master planning and development is essential to make our cities livable and sustainable. To talk about Singapore's experience in detail will be a full 13-week course which we are doing for the Lee Kuan Yew School's MPA and MPP program. So I'm helping to advertise for my friend Dean Kishore. But for the busy mayor, or senior city official, you can sign up for the CLC's and Temasek Foundation's 5-day Leaders in Urban Governance program. But let me very briefly touch on some of our experience in Singapore that kind of brings out the principles of the livability framework. Let me first talk about Singapore's environmental challenge, our environment, which is clean, green, and blue. A lot of trade-offs are needed to achieve the environmental outcomes for a rapidly growing city. The population grows, more factories and other buildings are put up, and all these contribute to many sources of pollution of our air, our water, and land. At the same time, greenery and nature are threatened. Let's take a look first at greenery. I mean, on the map, on the slide, you see a green map and a blue map. So let's look at greenery. In Singapore, if you look at satellite pictures, you will see that between 1986 and 2010, despite the growth in population from 2.7 million to 5 million, the green cover in Singapore grew from 35% to almost 50%. And 10% of the land is committed as green space, with half gazetted as nature reserves. So we actually became greener even as we became more populated and denser. And it's not just about planting trees and shrubs, but doing it systematically alongside land use plans and infrastructure development like roads, and establishing standards for greenery. The National Parks Board is the agency that's responsible for greening Singapore, and it is staffed with good professionals who have scoured the world to find the right trees and plants that will provide shade and are easy to maintain. We have more than 300 parks, and the goal is to have a park within a 10-minute walk of almost every household. So innovations like the extensive network of park connectors, which will be doubled from the current 170 kilometers, and nature ways will transform Singapore from a garden city to a city in the garden. So let's look at water. It's a big resource challenge for Singapore. Although we get 2.4 meters of rain in a tropical climate, equatorial climate, our challenge is that we do not have the land to collect and store all that rain. So with a strong leadership focus to tackle the problem and an integrated approach to managing water, we have now overcome our water handicap, and we have a sustainable supply of water from several different sources, which we call the 4 national taps. We try to harvest every drop of rainwater, so we have the most extensive urban stormwater catchment in any city in the world. 2/3 of Singapore is water catchment, collecting the rainwater into 17 reservoirs, including the Marina Reservoir, which is right in the heart of the city center. And it is formed by the Marina Barrage, which is also a flood barrier and a recreational lake in the city. So this has been achieved through strong leadership, which empowers an agency, the PUB, to plan and work with other agencies like the URA, HDB, JTC, and NEA to ensure that the land that collects water is well regulated in terms of land use and activities. Pollution is tackled at source, and there's a separate stormwater and sewer system. It is this sort of overall systems approach to create the policies, the regulations, the plans and programs with good leadership and institutions that also involve the private sector and people that has been responsible for our success in ensuring that we not only have sustainable water supply, but also ensures there are no polluted waterways and fewer floods. Water is now not just managed as a resource, but also seeing it as as part of the broader urban system as an environmental asset. So the PUB is our national water agency, and it has a program called the Active, Beautiful and Clean Waters Program, the ABC Waters Program, where projects are envisaged that will gradually make the blue map that you saw earlier a reality, with the renaturalizing of the waterways, like what has been done, as shown here in the slide, in Bishan Park, where a concrete canal has been turned into a meandering river in the park. Today, on our economy, is consistently rated as one of the world's most competitive economies. Many cities are keen to see economic growth, as jobs are needed to give people the better quality of life they seek.
Previous slide.
Okay, sorry, all right. But economic development, if not managed in a balanced way, can severely pollute or destroy the environment and reduce the quality of life. So in Singapore, we took from the outset a balanced approach to economic development that is not about developing first and then cleaning up later, but to ensure that even as we develop, the industries do not pollute. So our industrial infrastructure is also planned in tandem with economic development. So initially, as we moved into labor-intensive industry from an entrepreneur economy, we developed industrial parks like the Jurong Industrial Estate. But as we moved up the economic ladder, we built industries within HDB towns, business parks, the biopolice, and the clean tech park. So it's an example of while we have plans that we are able to adapt and have flexibility as circumstances change. But ultimately, the most important litmus test of a city's livability is how the average citizen lives. And here, Singapore has excelled in our public housing program, which now houses 80% of our population. The housing agency, the Housing Development Board, HDB, sees its role not just as a developer of flats, but as a planner, a promoter, and a facilitator of well-integrated communities where people live, work, and play. The HDB towns are well-planned, integrated towns, not just in terms of land use activities, but are also socially integrated with different income and ethnic groups living together and provided with many social facilities like sports and community centers, schools and kindergartens, nursing homes, parks, polyclinics, hospitals and churches, temples and mosques. HDB is constantly innovating, and the new towns now being planned and built are even more livable and sustainable. So for example, the Punggol town, which is a town where an artificial waterway has been created to link two new reservoirs that abut the town. So this is really a waterfront eco-town. Transport planning is well integrated with land use. In land-constrained Singapore, where roads already take up 12% of our land, we have a policy well known to increasingly move towards planning to reduce the need for travel and to encourage walking and cycling, which are more sustainable. And this is in addition to the well-known emphasis already on public transport and making the car unattractive through high ownership costs, the certificate of entitlement, as well as usage costs through electronic road pricing. And we have a national cycling plan now to build 700 kilometers of bike paths by the year 2030. So in achieving the outcomes I talk about, in every case, there's an integrated approach to planning and development. And as I mentioned, this is the technocratic system that underpins successful and sustained delivery of plans and programs. So in Singapore's case, the delivery is undertaken largely by executive agencies, many of which were established 50 or more years ago and are staffed by highly competent professionals. There's also a well-established private sector, as well as a strong NGO and grassroots movement that provide good feedback and help to mobilize support for plans and programs. At a macro level, Singapore plans long-term for the next 40 to 50 years using our concept plan, which is a strategic land use and transport blueprint. Guided by the concept plan, the master plan for the next 10 to 15 years stipulates the type and intensity of land use, as well as sets the urban design guidelines for land use. The concept plan is updated every 10 years, and it's really an important process where productive fights among the agencies are fought over how much land is allocated for key users like roads, industry, housing, parks, infrastructure, and community facilities. But the key to what really has been responsible for our successful outcomes as a livable and sustainable city is dynamic urban governance. This is the single most critical prerequisite, and we have shown this as the foundation that underpins everything else in our livability framework. Leadership is key in governance, although not the only element. And we've been very fortunate to have a visionary and yet pragmatic leader, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, after whom the school is named. But we need leaders at every level. Mr. Lee's legacy to Singapore is the governance system that he has helped to create, which ensures that technocrats are respected and empowered to tackle complex urban problems in a systematic way. The public service in Singapore has developed professionally because there is a culture of integrity that has been carefully instilled over the years through a personnel management system that recruits, rewards, and trains the best people with good pay, and that shows no tolerance for corruption. Equally critical is a respect for the rule of law. Legislation is well enforced fairly. The Singapore government recognized that it has to implement its policies, its plans and programs with the private sector and with the support of the people. A key governance approach is for us to harness market forces where they will improve efficiency or better allocate scarce resources, for example, land. So working with markets is a matter of fiscal prudence, and the government has successfully privatized telecommunications, power generation, and some parts of our public transport system. Working with the community as stakeholders has been a key principle of urban governance, and this has evolved from public education campaigns in the early years, for example, to keep Singapore clean and green, to save water, to an increasingly consultative approach. For example, focus group discussions when we formulate the concept and master plan. But beyond just consultation, many agencies now take a 3P, or a public, private, and people partnership approach. For example, the NParks Community in Bloom program, and using voluntary organizations to run our nursing homes and family centers. So this slide depicts succinctly what, in its essence, dynamic urban governance is all about. How a society dynamically decides what to achieve and forge trust and consensus in doing so among the government, the private, and the people sector. The conference is about Asian cities and secondary cities. The Lee Kuan Yew World City Prize, as Kishore mentioned earlier, recognizes cities that have undergone major transformation in recent years to become more livable, vibrant, and sustainable. And invariably, these cities show an integrated approach to planning and development and have dynamic urban governance. And this shows that the CLC Liveability Framework does have universal application. And some of these unique cities show and provide many good transformational lessons for our fast-growing Asian cities today. And this year's winner, as announced last week and mentioned by Kishore, is for the first time an Asian city, Suzhou in China. Suzhou has undergone remarkable transformation over the past 2 decades. Suzhou is actually an ancient city with 2,500 years of history. It is famed for its beautiful gardens and canals. In the 1980s, this was a sleepy town with polluted canals, traffic jams, and some badly polluting industries. With good governance and a long-term plan which was well executed, Suzhou is now one of the more dynamic, clean, and beautiful cities in China, which attracts investors and residents alike to enjoy its unpolluted air, water, and high quality of life. It is indeed one of the emerging secondary cities in China. Suzhou, of course, initially benefited a little bit from our experience, Singapore's experience and contributions in the 90s when the two governments, the Chinese government and the Singapore government, jointly set up its joint venture, Suzhou Industrial Park. However, since then, Suzhou has forged ahead with many more initiatives that have propelled the city forward. The first 2 winners of the Lee Kuan Yew World City Prize showed similar remarkable transformation thanks to good governance and planning. In 2010, Bilbao from Spain was awarded the inaugural Lee Kuan Yew World City Prize in recognition of its transformation of the city of Bilbao from a city in industrial decline to a modern and vibrant city. Mayor Inuka, who passed away 2 weeks ago, was instrumental in bringing about many tiers of government and society to buy into a common vision and transform the city beyond just the famous Guggenheim Museum project. The second winner in 2012 was New York City. This was a city devastated by the trauma of the 9/11 destruction of the World Trade Center towers. But Mayor Michael Bloomberg brought about a resurrection of the city with his Plan NYC initiative, which saw, among other successes, the pedestrianization of Broadway, making New York a more friendly cycling town and introducing many parks into the city to make it a lot more friendly and livable. So Dean Kishore Mahbubani, as mentioned earlier, he plays a very important part in the Lee Kuan Yew World City Prize. He's chair of the nominating committee, which is an international committee comprising some of the world's top experts in planning, in urban planning and governance. And it's really a very rigorous selection process, which include site visits by the jury. And I do hope that more of the secondary cities present here and in Asia will become winners in the years to come. As I said earlier, the CLC, shares our Singapore experience with many city leaders. And one way we do this is through the Temasek Foundation Leaders in Urban Governance program. Mayors and other city leaders spend a week studying the Singapore case study in detail and with experts who are practitioners. More than 20 cities have participated since the program, including many emerging cities from Asia: Quezon City, Metro Manila, Jakarta, Ho Chi Minh City, Kuching, Colombo, Chennai, Foshan, Yangon. And I think we have somebody from Makassar who attended the program, and he's now the mayor-elect of Makassar. Right? Yeah. So our next program will be run at the end of May, just before the World Mayor Forum and the World City Summit that runs from the 1st to the 4th of June. Final slide. We create various platforms to encourage cities to share and exchange knowledge and best practices. And our most important one, which has perhaps become the summit for cities, is the World City Summit. The first one was held in 2008, and in the last one in 2012, which was held together with the Singapore International Water Week and the Clean Environment Summit, we had some 19,000 delegates participating from more than 100 countries and 200 cities. The World Mayors Forum is also held every year, and this year we have our 4th World City Summit together with the Mayors Forum from the 1st to the 4th of June. If you are looking for an excuse to come back to Singapore, that is the time, and I welcome all of you to join us in the World Cities Summit and Mayors Forum. So I hope my sharing of a little bit of the Singapore's experience in sustainable urbanization has some value to this conference, and I would like to take the opportunity to congratulate the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in celebrating its 10th year anniversary, and hopefully many more to come. Thank you.
On behalf of the organizers, thank you very much to our two keynote speakers for setting the scene. I trust that many of us now have a lot of questions that you would like to pose to the speakers, but painfully, as my role to control the time and to make sure that we have enough time to also informally network among each other, there will be no question Q&A at the moment. They have successfully set the scene for us to talk about the opportunities of emerging cities, also the challenges of emerging cities. And then the Singapore story provides possibilities for solutions. The integratedness of Singapore government is one of the key ingredients that has been emphasized over the years. So I hope this first session has allowed all of us to have a better picture of the opportunities and challenges of emerging cities. And we'll go into much more in-depth in the next session, and also in the afternoon session with Microsoft, and tomorrow's long day session as well for the simulations that will allow for all of us to go in much more depth on these issues. So please join me once again to thank our wonderful keynote speakers this morning.